Hello, everyone. Dear colleagues, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to this climate action consultation meeting. I am Virginia Fernandez-Trapa, Program Coordinator at the Sustainable Development of Tourism Department in UNWTO. And I'm pleased to be facilitating this meeting today as it is part of the implementation of the Glasgow Declaration, which I coordinate. Next slide, please. As you would all have seen in the agenda, we have structured the meeting in two main blocks. During the first part, we will be presenting the policy guidance to support climate action by national tourism administrations. And during the second part, we will be presenting the Glasgow Declaration Engagement Pack for national tourism administrations. Both sections will have a space for questions and answers after the presentations, and there will also be two agenda items for countries to make statements should you wish to share with everyone in the call on your policies or on your projects related to climate action. Next, please. So without further ado, I am honored to invite our Executive Director, Ms. Zorica Urošević, to deliver welcome remarks. Dear Zorica, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I know that we have different time zones. Good evening as well and good night for Susanna. I first wanted to thank Becca Kelly, the Director for External Relations, for helping us to coordinate with all the regional departments your active participation, and we are thrilled that we will be able to conduct maybe one of this kind, but not the last climate action consultation meeting. Thank you for your availability to support this process. And I would like to congratulate you on your nomination as Climate Action Focal Point with the World Tourism Organization. We know that climate change is one of the greatest challenges that humanity is facing. And the consequences of climate change are already being felt around the world. You know very well that we reached the end of the hottest year on record. And you as well very well know that this summer has been pretty difficult to handle for many destinations. So climate change is impacting the tourism sector. Our researchers identified that 28% of global destinations have already been affected by climate change this year, and that tourism is vulnerable to climate impacts and at the same time can play an important role in reducing climate risk. And this is the whole purpose of our discussion and of the work that we carry out. So tourism can reduce its greenhouse emissions, and tourism can support destinations adapt to a changing climate, in particular in coastal destinations where tourism operates at the frontiers of any storm. Since COVID-19 hit our sector harder than any other industry, we have come to know what zero tourism looks like. You would all remember this beautiful planet that was blue and green, and there was no red, no black, no other color besides the pure colors of the planet itself. So we have realized that opportunities that our sector represent for sustainable development. And we are as well seeing a growing consensus that tourism needs to put people at the center and operate within planetary limits to remain resilient. We now need to accelerate tourism transition to low carbon operations to reach net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. Through the Glasgow Declaration on Tourism Climate Action, we are already seeing increasing commitment from tourism stakeholders. As you very well know, the Glasgow Declaration was endorsed as a voluntary commitment by the UNWTO Executive Council as its 116th session in Jeddah in June 22, and member states were encouraged to promote the declaration. But of course, climate action will require the full integration of a circular business model in tourism to decarbonize, as well as to build a regenerative model for biodiversity. We speak here about mitigation and adaptation. Today's workshop is the first step for us to establish a mechanism through which climate action can be discussed more frequently with our member states. And we are as well looking at actually bringing that work and that discussion on the regular meetings of the Sustainability Committee that you very well know. The documents that will be presented today have been developed within the framework of the implementation of the Glasgow Declaration. These documents are aiming at providing you with relevant information on climate policy making, as well as with recommendations on how to implement climate action and the Glasgow Declaration, if it is of help for your destination. Because countries can also become signatories of the Glasgow Declaration, and we understand the complexity you may encounter as tourism ministries, because we are not leading climate action at national level. This needs to be done in consultation with other ministries. We know the complexity of tourism governance when it comes to climate, but it's well, and when it comes to job, and when it comes to social or culture aspect, it's always necessary to build up with other portfolio ministries. As of August 23, the declaration counts over 800 signatories. 56% are businesses, 34% are supporting organizations, and 10% are destinations. And among the destinations, we find over 70 DMOs at subnational government level, but also 13 national level signatories, including NTO and NTAs. We hope to welcome many more NTO and NTAs on board very soon, and we are all in this together. Climate change is our biggest threat, but tourism can be part of the solution. So let's make our effort count. And really, I truly appreciate your presence here today, and I would like to invite you, each and every one, to join us on this journey for people, planet, and prosperity. But most importantly, to be active and asking as many questions as you can. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Soritza, for your welcome remarks, very inspiring words. As you said, we're all in this together. So hopefully these meetings will provide us a platform that helps everyone advance. Okay, let's then move on to the first block of content in our meeting today, which is the presentation of the policy guidance to support climate action by national tourism administrations. But before we do, as otherwise I would probably forget, I maybe want to propose that we take a group photo. Susanne, if you don't mind, maybe stop sharing for a second, and I'd like to kindly ask all the colleagues connected to turn on their cameras so that we can do a few screenshots really quickly to get the memory of this meeting. Our colleague Roxana is helping with the screenshot. All good?
Yeah, colleagues, please make sure your camera is on and look at the camera to record this beautiful moment. Thank you.
Okay.
We good?
We're good. Thank you for this.
Star system over.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now let's move on to the first block. As I was saying, this would be the presentation of the policy guidance. Next slide. Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. This document has been produced within the framework of One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program, which, as many of you know, provides the umbrella for the implementation of Glasgow Declaration, and where we at UNWTO collaborate closely with the United Nations Environment Program. I'll take just another second to introduce my colleagues working on the One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program. On our side, Roxana Ashtari, project specialist, working together with us in UNWTO. And on the side of the United Nations Environment Program, our colleague Svitlana Mikhailieva, coordinator of the Sustainable Tourism Program in UNEP. Svitlana, I think they can see you waving. Thank you so much, colleagues, for your support and for being connected today. So developing this policy guidance has been possible thanks to a financial contribution received from UNEP, for which we are very grateful. And we also expect to release the final document, not only in collaboration with UNEP, but also in collaboration with United Nations Climate Change. That's why you see their logo on the slide. And I have the pleasure to be sharing today the floor with Professor Susan Becken. Susan is a professor of sustainable tourism at Griffith University in Australia, and she also works part-time for the New Zealand government in the Department of Conservation as a science investment advisor, and her own research has focused on climate change and tourism for over 2 decades. I'm sure many of you would have read many of her research pieces. Thank you, Susanne, also for being with us and for being awake in the middle of the night in New Zealand. Next, please. So I'll just provide a brief context to our discussion today. We heard it in Mrs. Urošević's remarks. We are facing a climate emergency, and that's the reason why in 2015 countries adopted the Paris Agreement, which, as many of you know, has the main objective to limit global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and also aims at pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius if possible. This is the only way to actually prevent irreversible impacts. We see how the ice is melting, we see the disasters, we see corals bleaching. We don't want this to be irreversible, so we really have to act now. And the Paris Agreement, of course, does not only have a focus on mitigation, but it also aims at supporting countries deal with the impacts of climate change, so adaptation, and it aims at making finance flows consistent with the transition that needs to happen towards low carbon. Next, please. So how does all this connect to the tourism sector, which is not explicitly mentioned in the Paris Agreement? It is because given the, let's say, dependence on healthy ecosystems that tourism operations have, we depend on pristine landscapes, etc. Tourism is very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. If we think of rising sea levels or extreme weather, they clearly threaten tourism infrastructure. Coastal erosion can damage beaches, which are a major asset for destinations. Warming temperatures can result in loss of biodiversity. I mean, temperature variations with shorter winter or longer summer, etc., can impact the comfort levels of tourists, and therefore they can actually impact the attractiveness of destinations. At UNWTO, we are regularly monitoring national tourism policies, the evolution of policies, and we have seen an increase of the references to climate change in national tourism policies from 42% in 2019 to 62% in 2022. This is a good thing, but references are still quite brief and not exactly actionable. We don't really see, by looking at the policies, what are the policy instruments available to implement those objectives. So in parallel, we are also monitoring nationally determined contributions, the so-called NDCs, which are the national plans that countries have to submit to explain how they are implementing the Paris Agreement. So they are, in the NDCs, countries are setting their targets for emissions reductions, and in these documents, the references to tourism have also increased from 42% in 2019 to 53% last year, 2022, and most of those references are mentioning tourism as a vulnerable sector. Next, please. So we are a vulnerable sector, that is clear, but at the same time, our sector contributes to emitting greenhouse gas emissions, which are the cause of global warming. It is difficult to measure greenhouse gases related to tourism operations because our sector has an extensive value chain. Nevertheless, the latest studies point at greenhouse gases related to tourism representing more or less between 8 and 11% of global greenhouse gases. Transport, as you can imagine, is a major cause of tourism-related emissions, but there are also things maybe we don't think of so prominently, which have an important footprint. For instance, the food that our sector consumes and many other elements. You can see on the pie in the screen, there's a split of emissions. This is from a report published by UNEP together with WTTC called Net Zero Roadmap. And the distribution is not necessarily globally accepted, but it does give you a good overview to get an idea of our footprint. Next, please. In 2019, we collaborated with the International Transport Forum to prepare the report that you see on the screen. There we were measuring just transport-related emissions, as we said, the largest part of our emissions. And the main findings were pretty alarming. We identified that emissions from transport in tourism had grown by 62% from 2005 to 2016. And on top of that, we were again going to increase emissions by 25% on a business as usual scenario. This was considered a very, let's say, as I mentioned, alarming finding, because it meant that we were going to basically miss the global climate goals. If you remember the 1.5 degrees Celsius for limiting global warming, the science behind that tells us that by 2030, we have to reduce emissions by 43%. Compared to 2010 levels. And we were not only going to reduce 43%, but the opposite, increased 25%. So that was, let's say, for us, the signal that we really needed to start making a much stronger call to all tourism stakeholders to take the issue of climate very seriously. And we started asking from our member states, from you, that you would raise climate ambition. Next, please. That led to basically the launch of Glasgow Declaration in November 2021. At the United Nations Climate Change COP26, and the launch was very well received, even if at the time we still had COVID rampant and a lot of uncertainty. Now that the forecasts indicate that by the end of this year, 2023, we will almost have recovered tourism activity fully to pre-pandemic levels, the need to work on climate action is even becoming, let's say, more pressing, because at the end, more tourism operations mean more emissions, and we have come to realize that the health of our planet is also directly connected to our health, and on top of that, to the competitiveness, to the sustainability, and to the resilience of our sector. So since the launch of Glasgow Declaration, many of you have been voicing the complexities of taking climate action, because, as our executive director mentioned, is not one of the typical competences of national tourism administrations or national tourism organizations. So we therefore embarked, with the support of our executive director and the management, in the development of this policy guidance to support climate action by NTAs. And I will now hand over to Professor Becken, who's been collaborating with us on this project, so that she can share with us the overview of the guidance. Susanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Virginia, and well, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's really great to see so many of you on the screen, and we're looking forward to feedback on the policy guidance and also on the Glasgow Declaration signatory pack. So I will present a few slides to summarize the document on the policy guidance, and then we have time for you to add any questions, ideas, and make a statement how you're approaching this in your country. So really looking forward to that. I start by just clarifying the target audience for the policy guidance, because we know that tourism in the public sector at national government level is obviously represented in quite different ways. And we just put a few examples here to the left, Lithuania, Norway, Brazil, and I won't go into the complexities, but you can see it's just about different in every country. So we hope that the guidance is relevant for whatever way tourism is represented. For ease, we just call it NTA now, National Tourism Administration, but it includes national tourism organizations, marketing boards, departments, subsets of other ministries. So anyone who is tasked with managing or promoting tourism in government, hopefully will gain benefit from this guidance. Now, just again, to reiterate, and we heard it in the opening remarks so far, why does tourism need to get involved in climate policy? It's not something that has been done in the past extensively. And I mean, one reason is because climate change is accelerating, and it's actually actively starting to disrupt and affect tourism, whether that's for extreme events or longer term changes at the destination. Virginia mentioned, for example, coral bleaching. We're now in the snow industries, there's changes. So destinations have to adapt, and some policy changes required maybe to enable this. The second one, quite clearly, tourism is a significant contributor, and with the fast recovery of tourism, which is really great to see, but the emissions, of course, come back as well. So we need to find ways to decouple tourism from the carbon or greenhouse gas emissions more widely. The third one is really important because climate policy is being done anyway. In most countries now, in fact, almost all of them have climate policy frameworks. It will affect tourism, and it is better to be at the table and make sure that the policies implemented are understood, or also even take into consideration the role of tourism. And then the last one, which is really important for the long-term viability of tourism, for its competitiveness and sustainability and also resilience, it will be necessary to engage with climate change. So there's different types of approaches that NTAs can take, and we group them broadly into 4 sort of quadrants of this pie. The first one is really about sort of collaboration and integration at the national government level with other agencies, and that could be specifically the climate change Ministry for Environment, sometimes it's Department of Energy. Again, it depends. So that part of government that develops policy, or other agencies like transport, energy, and so on. So that's the first one. The second one is the actual tourism policy making, and what types of instruments or levers we have to actually address climate change. The third one, and for some tourism organizations, marketing boards, for example, it's the biggest one. It's the marketing, it's the promotion. How can we shift that towards being more climate aware? And then the fourth one, which is obviously really crucial to all of this, is how do we finance the transition, and what types of partnerships or governance arrangements are required? Now, on the left, we just put the Sustainable Development Goals, because it's really important that climate change is not isolated from some of these other activities. As we all know, it has to do with sustainable production and consumption, with energy, with protecting our environment, and so on. So it needs to be integrated, and it needs to be part of the same sort of transition moving forward. So I will now go for the 4 quadrants. And then sum up, and then we can discuss. I will start with the first one around, okay, what's national climate policy? And we identified that's based on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, how they distinguish this formal government policy, which is really the type of work Virginia mentioned. Governments submit nationally determined contributions. They submit that to the UNFCCC. They have international reporting obligations, and underneath that, there's specific climate laws. Maybe a government set up a climate commission or some other body. There could be carbon taxes or other forms of incentives. So that's the formal climate policy. Which is probably where most of the action is happening. But then, in addition to that, and that's what's really relevant for tourism, because tourism cuts across so many other parts of government. That's the sectoral policy, which I mentioned earlier: Ministry of Transport, infrastructure development, nature conservation. All of those sectors also do policy, sometimes specifically for climate action, other times as a secondary benefit. Transportation, for example, really important. Investments into public transport, rail infrastructure. That's the kind of work where tourism can benefit from working with those other parts of government. And then the third one, as in the pie earlier, is the tourism-specific one that either addresses some of the gaps, or that really focuses on supporting the sector in this transition. Now, just briefly again, we did hear that some of the in fact, more than half of the NDCs already address tourism. Sometimes it's only done in passing. Some other NDCs actually address it in a quite detailed way, suggesting, for example, initiatives for energy efficiency to support tourism. The NDC of Namibia, for example, is interesting. It focuses specifically on the intersect with nature conservation and the opportunities that come for ecotourism. So there's different FAUCI and levels where tourism is included, sometimes already with measurement of progress. That is rare, but that can be improved. So it is, they are all publicly available. It's quite interesting to have a bit of look how tourism is treated in other countries. The same with national adaptation plans, which are more relevant to developing countries, but again, a growing number actually consider tourism as a sector that needs specific attention. There can be major synergies, as I mentioned, between the climate policy, tourism, and other areas. So, for example, regrowing forest, in particular mangrove forest, quite important for tourism in island states, and building resilience and natural assets potentially for ecotourism. So synergies are possible. At the same time, some tourism strategies start to recognize here, the Norwegian one is an example to say, okay, tourism must also comply with those international and national regulations and frameworks, whether it's carbon taxes or other things. So tourism strategies need to be aware of that and do their bit to deliver on those national goals. Okay, so now just going a bit more into the policy instruments, and these will not be new to you. They are effectively the sort of toolbox that governments have, and in the guidance we provide a lot of examples of what's already happening. For example, most countries do have indeed tourism strategies. Sometimes they're called master plans or action plans. Some already include climate change. Some have standalone plans. In New Zealand, for example, we just released a national adaptation roadmap for tourism, and we're working on a decarbonization plan. So they are standalone, but they are still aligned with the wider tourism strategy. But there's different models, and it depends on the country circumstances, what works best. Regulation often is actually done by other parts of government, for example, vehicle emission standards, but there are examples of tourism-specific regulation that could support climate action, for example, for particular recreational vehicles, or maybe particular licensing for hotels and renewable energy installations or so. Economic levers, also a big topic, of course, in tourism around sort of finance and sustainable, levies, carbon taxes. Again, they are often more general, but there are tourism-specific examples, maybe more in the aviation sector, where there could be emission charges, for example. Information, absolutely crucial. So we will come back to the role of measurement a bit later, but obviously doing some carbon measurement and footprinting is important to understand the baseline, but also to measure progress, set the targets, and maybe then develop specific options, for example, low carbon itineraries or so. And that can work quite well with the trend in the corporate world around increased mandatory reporting, like Hong Kong, for example. The hotels in Hong Kong find themselves now having to report on their carbon, including the whole supply chain. And so that trickles down to a much wider uptake in the full ESG legislation. Training, we find that it's actually really important across all fronts of the sector. So staff training around carbon literacy or sustainability more widely, it's actually not really done a lot. At the universities, we've actually just done an analysis of how many tourism curricula globally include climate change. It's very, very few. So we need to do better. And of course, the visitors need to get the right information as well. So capability building is really crucial. And then, of course, there's the whole suite of voluntary actions, carbon offsetting, certification, certain campaigns, and that could involve a wide range of stakeholders, including the visitors and communities, and help to build partnerships. So that's sort of a mix of instruments that could be used. alongside, of course, in many countries, so both where I operate, New Zealand, Australia, the majority of budget is actually in the tourism boards with for marketing. So in some ways, they are the biggest lever to maybe infuse some change through particular low carbon marketing campaigns. And we've seen some interesting examples actually also during the COVID pandemic, when countries innovatively pivoted towards domestic marketing with quite some cool ideas. The Faroe Islands in Europe, an interesting example of specifically marketing for volunteers to come and help restore the environment. So there's different ways of doing that, or just changing how visitor mix, like some countries are starting to look at the carbon implications of their target segments. So that's a big area, I think, where change is possible. At the same time, some countries start to directly address tourist behavior through pledges. Palau or New Zealand are examples, or some at destination level as well, just to encourage the visitor to be more aware and make different choices. Now, the final one around climate finance and partnership, obviously absolutely crucial, but important to understand the difference. So a lot of funding is available through government itself, but not necessarily within tourism, but for other departments or ministries. For example, climate funds, energy programs, where tourism could actually potentially apply or be part of a wider collaboration. So that's important to be aware of, and also, for example, encourage businesses, if there are grants for energy audits or something like that, to be part of that. On the other side, there's the financial markets and systems. There's different instruments. It is a bit harder for tourism and the small businesses to tap into those, but there are a growing number of examples of larger tourism companies that tap into, for example, sustainability-linked loans, bonds, and so on. So that's something that can be explored, in how maybe the NTA can help with tourism being a greater part of this green finance landscape. For developing countries, there's obviously international climate finance. And again, it probably means that the tourism part, the NTA, has to go through the climate focal point. Upskilling might be needed just to even understand. It's quite a complex landscape, but there's certainly lots of opportunities. So it comes back to partnerships across government. There's examples of public-private partnerships, for example, in aviation, but also more at local level. For example, in the nature regeneration space, where climate and other positive outcomes can work together. For some of those, different governance arrangements might be helpful. The best example that comes to my mind is actually in Asia, in the Mekong, where 6 countries of the Mekong region have teamed up for quite some, at least 10 years now, to really work together to pool resources, to find common denominators, and climate action is one of their pillars of activity, alongside marketing and corridors and so on. But so that's kind of, I guess, an enabling factor that's absolutely crucial. And with that, sort of a short summary of the wider document, we would be very interested to hear from you anything